The Old West seems like a setting that's ripe for video games. But with the notable exceptions of Red Dead Redemption and the Call of Juarez series, that potential has largely gone untapped. I had never played a Call of Juarez game before, but that didn't seem to matter because Gunslinger, the fourth game in the series, is unrelated to its predecessors. There's a token mention of Juarez, Mexico about halfway through the story, but at this point the franchise name is pretty much just branding. Gunslinger basically plays much like an 1880s version of Call of Duty. The levels are extremely linear and set-piece driven. There's a 2-gun at a time limit. When you breach doors, the game goes into bullet time, so you can unfairly shoot everyone in the head before they've had time to react. And of course, there are QuickTime events. As in Call of Duty, those mechanics are designed to make the game feel more cinematic, but also facilitate a power fantasy for the player. That's one of the really troubling things about the recent Call of Duty games. Contextualizing games which are ostensibly based on modern warfare as power fantasies is a little uncomfortable. That problem is completely sidestepped in Gunslinger. Instead of supposedly real events, you're playing out the legendary exploits of bounty hunter Silas Greaves, as told to a group of saloon patrons. Greaves is an unreliable narrator. Not only does he forget details and misremember events, he also stretches the truth a fair bit.
Well, son, there had to be at least 100 Apaches surrounding me.
100?
God be my witness.
Oh, come on. Who are you kidding?
Hey, I believe you.
Most of what you're playing out is fiction, even within the context of the story. Greaves claims to have had encounters with just about every famous figure from the American West you can think of. Butch Cassidy, Doc Holliday, Billy the Kid, Wyatt Earp, and Jesse James all get mentioned or make appearances. And like some sort of gunslinging version of Forrest Gump, Greaves says he's had a significant part in each of their stories that history naturally failed to record.
Billy looked at me and said, "About time, amigo. Grab a gun and get to the window."
Wait, so you were friends with Billy the Kid?
Yeah, sort of.
Greaves has an obvious vested interest in building up his legend in the minds of his listeners, and because of that, game mechanics like bullet time and regenerating health jive with his story. The protagonist is awesome and superhuman because he's in charge of the story. Making Greaves an unreliable narrator was a stroke of brilliance. It's a great way to hand-wave all the silly stuff the game pulls, and the game knows it's being silly. The people listening to Greaves' story will even call him out on contrivances, inconsistencies, and the generally incredible nature of his tales.
Yep, the Apaches always appeared out of nowhere, and there never seemed to be an end to it.
Hold on. Were you attacked by Apaches? What happened to the cowboys?
Did I say they were Apaches? I said Clanton's cowboys attacked me Apache style. I was in a pitched battle, but I was holding my own against an overwhelming enemy force.
Sometimes the game world will change before your eyes as Greaves revises his story. It really makes you think about how many contrivances, both large and small, are in a typical game. Gunslinger pokes fun at these while still using them. One of the funnier moments in the game for me was when it claimed that this level was set somewhere in Missouri. Now, I live in Missouri, and I can assure you that we haven't got mountains like this anywhere. The tallest point in Missouri looks like this. I can't tell if this was an intentional joke, but I really hope it was. I got a good laugh out of it. Gunslinger beautifully addresses problems that so many shooters and so many big-budget games seem to have. They want to be taken seriously. They aspire to realism, and yet their game mechanics are often at odds with those goals. A typical AAA shooter has you traversing ridiculous action set pieces while killing hundreds of human enemies, an action that often gets labeled as plainly heroic. The things typical game protagonists do in typical action games are ludicrous, orders of magnitude more stupid than action movie protagonists. And that's all fine if the story matches, but so often it doesn't. Gunslinger knows that one person taking on a whole gang of enemies single-handedly is beyond unbelievable. It knows it's silly for one person to have had such an action-packed life and lived to tell about it. It even has the common sense to realize that a character who guns down hundreds of men in pursuit of revenge shouldn't be characterized as a hero. While Gunslinger isn't as deconstructionist as Spec Ops: The Line, it critiques a lot of the same conventions and has fun doing it. This is the funny Spec Ops. Unfortunately, the worst part of Gunslinger is the gameplay itself. It's competent, it's even quite a bit of fun at times, but it stumbles enough to significantly blight the experience. This is the sort of game that thinks the best way to tell the player they're getting shot is to obscure your vision with red splatters and bullet holes. I guess it's effective, but it just makes it harder to shoot the guys who are killing you. Many times I ended up in a death spiral because I got shot from a direction I wasn't expecting and couldn't see the bad guys through all the junk on the screen. In general, I like the art style. It reminds me of Borderlands, especially the character introductions. Unfortunately, Gunslinger doesn't fully commit to the faux cel-shaded look of Borderlands. We don't get nice, clean lines around enemies, so everything tends to blend together a little too much. It's hard to distinguish distant enemies from the background in the middle of an intense firefight. Lighting is part of the problem. A lot of levels are dark, and those which are set in sunlight have deep, high-contrast shadows, which further obscure enemies. QuickTime events end in instant death if you mess up. Since the whole game is narrated, dying really breaks the flow of the story.
They all thought I was Billy, and all that blame would fall on him.
On normal difficulty, most enemies die in 1 or 2 shots to their center of mass, or just 1 headshot. That feels about right, but later on the game will occasionally throw armored bullet sponges at you, and those are really irritating to deal with. They even managed to work riot shield guys into the game somehow. These kind of enemies just don't feel right in the Western setting. The worst offender was a battle with a Gatling gunner. You have to throw like 10 sticks of dynamite at him before he finally dies, and you can only do that between volleys of Gatling gun fire. Half the battle I was just sitting behind cover doing nothing. It's not a hard fight, it's just really tedious and not much fun. And that's how this game plays in a nutshell. It's certainly not all bad. Dueling is Gunslinger's most unique gameplay feature, and its best. This mode requires you to split your attention between focusing on your enemy and keeping Silas's hand in the right spot to quickly draw his gun. It's effective at building tension and a lot more satisfying and interesting than a quick-time event sequence. Gunslinger distinguishes itself in the crowded shooter market with its Western theming, which is used to great effect in the narrative and presentation. It's smarter and more self-aware than your average game in these categories, using a couple of well-chosen literary techniques to tell a competent story that manages quite a bit of humor and even some moments of poignancy. It's just a shame the gameplay doesn't feel anywhere near as fresh as the presentation.